It began with two women and young men, and a charge of
Who
rape.
said what when?
Rising to envelop a Jewish lawyer from New York, the justice system in Alabama, the American Communist Party, the United States Supreme Court, the attention of the nation. It began with two women and 9 young men.
The fact is they're black.
What really happened?
That's what convicted them.
Scottsboro, an American tragedy. Tonight on American Experience. Major funding for American Experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. National corporate funding is provided by Liberty Mutual and the Scotts Company.
This program has been made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hear the rattle of gravel as it rides whistling through the day and night. Not the old or the young on it, nor people with any difference in their color or shape. Not girls or men, Negroes or white, but people with this in common. People that no one had use for, had nothing to give to, no place to offer, but the cause of a freight train careening through Paint Rock, through Memphis, through town after town without halting.
Well, I've had people that knew that you and I were going to have this conversation, and some of them said, oh, don't do it, don't stir it up again. I said, well, it's a part of us.
It begins with a fairly clear-cut issue of black and white, of sexuality, of rape. Then it becomes increasingly confused.
The image of black men was that they were anxious at all times to rape a white woman. And it was the Scottsboro case that met that issue head on.
Will you let them murder the 9 Negro boys in Scottsboro? No. Louder. No. Organize. Demonstrate. Protest. Raise your voices.
What Scottsboro teaches us is that you cannot underestimate the power of our history as it relates to race, as it relates to poverty, as it relates to sectionalism in the struggle for justice.
There are heroes in the story, but that's the footnote to this story. The tragedy of this are 9 boys' lives, hopelessly, eternally interrupted, sent cascading down roads of terror and imprisonment. No, I don't think there's any way to see this story, but it's a great tragedy.
On the morning of March 25th, 1931, a freight of the Southern Rail Corporation left Chattanooga, Tennessee, bound for points west. Scattered among the cars of the freight were some 24 hobos, black and white. A few minutes out of Lookout Mountain, the train dipped into the northeastern corner of Alabama.
As the train emerged from the tunnel under Lookout Mountain, a group of whites was moving along the top of the train, and they stepped on the hand of one of the blacks and almost knocked him off the train.
The hand belonged to an 18-year-old named Haywood Patterson, who was on his way to Memphis to look for work.
We was just minding our own business when one of them said, "This is a white man's train. All you nigger bastards unload." But we weren't going nowhere, so there was a fight. We got the best of it and threw them off. Haywood Patterson.
Word of the fight reached the tiny town of Paint Rock, Alabama, where the train was scheduled to stop and take on water.
In Paint Rock, news goes out that there is a gang of blacks, gang of Negroes on the train that beat up a gang of whites. A posse is organized. Virtually every man in Paint Rock with a gun or a rope shows up. The train stops. The posse goes up and down the train looking in all the cars.
What they thought they were going to find is a group of blacks who had beaten up a group of whites and thrown them off the train. Immediately, unexpected things begin to happen. That's what you most fear in a racial confrontation, is the unexpected.
Suddenly, from the shadows of a boxcar emerged two white women, pale and disheveled.
First, they weren't even aware that they were women. They were wearing overalls. They identified themselves as Victoria Price and Ruby Bates. And there are conflicting accounts about who said what when. But one of the young women said, "We've been raped. All these colored boys raped us." And that was it.
Bunch of people here, got the guys off the train, marched them up here, about where this old building right across from the white wrecked car is there, lined them up against the wall there.
I saw a lot of people surrounding those boys, many of them having guns, of course, and ropes or pieces of rope. They were intent on mayhem.
For any black man in Alabama, whenever you saw a group of white men with guns in the menacing, ominous way in which people were collected in Paint Rock, Alabama, you knew you were in a lot of trouble.
There were 9 prisoners in all. One of them was 19-year-old Clarence Norris.
The police was surrounded with a mob. They had shotguns, pistols, sticks, pieces of iron, everything. The crowd comes to holler, "Let's take these black son of bitches up here and put them to a tree." I just thought that I was gonna die.
Mr. Broadway sent up to the store and got a skein. I never heard that word before. A skein of plow line. And the rope was cut into pieces that where they could tie the hands of the ones that was under arrest. And then the next thing was how are we going to get them to Scottsboro?
The prisoners were loaded onto a truck and driven to the nearby town of Scottsboro.
On March 25th, 1931, a friend and I were playing basketball at the side of the Jackson County Jail. And we noticed a flatbed, stake-bodied truck stop in front of the jail with a guard with rifles on each corner. They quickly unloaded the prisoners.
Crowds were beginning to form outside the jail. The rumor was that they were going to go into the jail. There was already poles outside that they were going to break the door down with.
Cars, trucks, these coming all kinds of ways. The mob was. Bring them niggas out of there. If you don't bring them out of there, goddamn, we come in there and get them. That's all you can hear. All you can hear over that little town.
The sheriff goes out on the front porch and basically makes the comment to the growing crowd outside that the first individual that puts their foot on their doorstep, he's going to kill them.
As the situation became desperate, my father took his pistol off and gave it to his deputies. He walked out the front door right through the middle of the mob, and they separated for him. Not a hand touched him. He went to the courthouse and called the governor.
By the next morning, the National Guard had secured the jail, while newspapers identified what one called the 9 Negro brutes. Of the 9, Only 4 had known each other before their arrest. Charlie Weems, the oldest, was 19. Eugene Williams, the youngest, 13. Willie Roberson suffered from syphilis so severe he could barely walk. Olin Montgomery, nearly blind, had been looking for a job to pay for a pair of glasses. Clarence Norris had left behind 10 siblings in rural Georgia. Ozzie Powell had been found riding alone. Andy Wright, 19, and his 13-year-old brother Roy had ridden from Chattanooga together. It was Roy's first time away from home. Haywood Patterson had been riding the freight train so long, he said he could light a butt in the wind from the top of a moving car. By the time the 9 defendants had taken to the rails, the full brunt of the Depression had already struck the South, and no state was hurting worse than Alabama.
Alabama in the 1930s was literally a world coming apart, with massive unemployment in a state that had always been poor, with increasing conflict between both classes and races. It was a state that was in calamitous conditions. Families were disintegrating. Hobos were frequenting the railroads by the thousands and tens of thousands.
The 2 accusers also had been driven onto the rails by economic necessity. Ruby Bates, 17, and Victoria Price, 21, hailed from the cotton center of Huntsville, 40 miles from Scottsboro. They worked together in the poorest of the town's textile mills. At 21, Price was already twice married and had served time in the workhouse for adultery and vagrancy.
Victoria Price was tough, a survivor in every way. She hardly fit the stereotype of the young Southern lady. Hard-talking, tobacco chewing, but a kind of feistiness to her. Ruby Bates is totally different. Very quiet, soft-spoken. In effect, it was a kind of relationship in which Victoria totally dominated Ruby Bates.
The mills in which the girls worked employed mostly young women. They labored up to 14 hours a day in deafening noise, air choked with cotton lint, and near complete darkness. By 1931, wages in the mills had dropped so low that Victoria and Ruby could only afford to live in the black section of Huntsville, where they occasionally traded sex with both black and white men for food and clothing.
Their lives are, in fact, a complete violation of the ideals of segregation, but the second that they accuse a black man of rape, at least for an instant, they become pure white women.
The trials of the 9 defendants for rape got underway on Monday, April 6th, in the Scottsboro courthouse. It was a traditional trading day in town, but the usual crowd was swelled by thousands more from hundreds of miles around. Eventually, the largest crowd in Scottsboro's history squeezed into the courthouse square as a brass band played Dixie and Hail, Hail, the Gang's All Here. With the Scottsboro trials, the anti-lynching forces hoped to prove that in Alabama, the rule of law would prevail against the passions of the mob.
Here was an example of their doing it right, of showing to the world that they were capable of giving equal and fair justice to prisoners in the most emotional and threatening kinds of conditions.
As the trial began, Victoria Price took the stand and told a chilling story.
Norris says, well, the other 8 did it, but I didn't do it. And Patterson says, well, I didn't do it, but they did it. And it's the classic reaction of people trapped in a world where they know they're not going to be believed, where they have no resources, and so that's the way they explode.
The courthouse was full of people, and they were jumping about the seats with pistols. Nothing, wasn't a black person around nowhere. Everybody was white, but just us 9.
When they announced the verdict of guilty, people ran out, and the judge was trying to bring order, and as soon as the word got outside, the crowd outside went crazy.
The trials lasted 3 days. All 9 Scottsboro defendants were convicted of rape. The jury could not decide whether to sentence 13-year-old Roy Wright to life in prison or death. All the others were sentenced to die in the Alabama electric chair.
Understandably, they're terrified. They're in one of the most brutal prisons in the United States. They have the death sentence hanging over them, and they're like drowning individuals, grasping for a life raft, grasping for a life preserver, grasping for straws.
The second trial of the Scottsboro defendants had been moved to Decatur, a town in northeast Alabama. As it opened in April 1933, 300 spectators crowded the hallways waiting to enter the courtroom. Hundreds more gathered outside.
I went because of history. I had never seen anything like that before. And I wanted to know just how it would be carried on. When we entered the courtroom, we were not told the way to go. We knew the way to go because it was black on one side and white on the other.
Leibowitz had won a motion to try the defendants separately. To stand trial first, the state had selected Haywood Patterson.
If the prosecutors were going to win, and win big, Haywood Patterson was the best person to put on trial. Because Haywood Patterson was the exemplar of the bad Negro. He was someone who looked the closest you can imagine to a rapist, as far as the white imagination is concerned.
The 12 jurors ultimately chosen to sit in judgment of Patterson included a shopkeeper, a barber, a clerk, and several farmers. All of them were white. As the state prepared to present its case, newspapers reported the mysterious disappearance of Ruby Bates, who was rumored to have been kidnapped or even killed. Every effort by the prosecution and defense to find her had come up empty. More than ever, the prosecution would rise or fall on the testimony of Victoria Price alone.
Victoria Price gets on the stand and in a matter of minutes says she was riding on a freight train. Suddenly, a large group of blacks comes hopping over on to the car that she is on, quickly dispatches with her white companions, beats them up, throws them off the train, and then en masse holds her up, rips her clothes off, and rapes her.
But Leibowitz was unconcerned. For months, he had waited for just this moment, the chance to confront Victoria Price in a court of law. He began his cross-examination by setting out an exact replica of the freight train, which he had procured from the Lionel Toy Corporation.
I think at that moment, Sam Leibowitz realized that she may have been uneducated, but she was going to be a hell of a witness for the prosecution.
Again and again, Leibowitz attacked Price's story in every possible detail. Her location on the train, her physical condition, her movements on the day before the alleged rape. But in each case, Price was able to parry his attacks.
He finds dozens, scores of inconsistencies, yet she has a manner that makes it difficult for him to make his points. It wasn't that he'd never had a difficult witness before. It was that he'd never had a witness that said over and over, I can't remember. Usually a witness is defensive when they say, I can't remember. She aggressively said she couldn't remember and used it to her advantage.
Price had claimed that she and Bates had spent that night in a boarding house in Chattanooga, owned by a Mrs. Callie Broche. But Leibowitz had scoured Chattanooga and found no Callie Broche anywhere.
So he asked her dozens of questions about Miss Callie Broche and where she lived and what she looked like and had she ever met her before.
You went to bed in the lady's house?
Yes, sir.
Was it 1 floor or 2 floor?
I don't remember. 4 or 5 room house.
What sort of food? What did you do in the evening? What sort of bed or room?
I don't know.
By the way, Mrs. Price, as a matter of fact, the name of Mrs. Callie you apply to this boarding house lady is the same name of a boarding house lady used in the Saturday Evening Post stories. Isn't that where you got the name?
I never heard of that Callie.
The truth about Callie Broche was that she was a fictional character in stories that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. There was no Callie Broche on 7th Street in Chattanooga.
But to many Southerners, it had been a deep affront.
One possessed of that old Southern chivalry cannot read the transcript of the trial and keep within the law. The brutal manner in which Leibowitz cross-examines Mrs. Price makes one feel like reaching for his gun. The Sylacauga News.
He thought with each attack he was strengthening his case, and what he didn't understand was that with each attack on Victoria Price, he was weakening his case, because the audience saw this not as an attack as he saw it upon this woman of ill repute, this prostitute. They saw it as an attack on Southern womanhood.
Leibowitz's cross-examination had stirred deep memories among Southerners of humiliation suffered at the hands of the North.
In the minds of many Alabamans, by the middle of the trial in Judge Horton's court, this case is not so much about what happened on that freight train. This trial is a replaying of abolitionism, Civil War, and Reconstruction.